From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. A production of iHeartRadio.
Hello, welcome back to the show. My name is Matt.
My name is Noel.
They call me Ben. We're joined, as always, with our super producer, Paul, Mission Control Decant. Most importantly, you are here, and that makes this the stuff they don't want you to know. Today, we are diving into a story that must begin with a disclaimer. We're going to explore some disturbing stories, but they are stories we feel are important, even though they may not be appropriate for all listeners today. That's just something you should know at the top. We are exploring a very harrowing tale from what is generally called the troubled teen industry. We've discussed this in the past. Similar to the rehabilitation industry, there are bad actors, there is corruption, there are cover-ups, and there are conspiracies. In this world, we are not exploring today's topic alone. However, we are joined with our good friend, our colleague, the podcaster, the musician, the creator of Camp Hell. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Josh Thane. I don't know why I said that like we're in a live show, Josh.
Right. I feel like I should be walking out with my coffee mug right now.
Why is it that breathing into a mic sounds like a crowd? It's weird.
It's true. It's a susurrus. It's a susurrus.
That was all for you, Josh.
But yes, Josh, welcome. Full disclosure, everyone. I am an executive producer who works directly with Josh, and the show we're going to be talking about today is one of the ones that we collectively made. But Josh is the creator, producer, host, music director, and creator of this show, Camp Hell, Anneewakee. Josh, could you please introduce yourself to everybody here? Tell us about your background and just your history in the true crime space.
Hello, everybody. My name is Josh Thane, as they said, and I work in production. So I've been working with Matt and making some true crime podcasts for the past few years now. And I also do music. I play in a band, Migrant Worker, shamelessly promoting right now. And yeah, Matt, you're to thank for me following this rabbit hole of the story of Anneewakee, honestly. And I'm really glad you did, because it's been a wild ride.
It's been a long time coming. This is this podcast, which is available now, is something that you have been working on for quite a while, Josh, from the initial story. And it's one of those stories that I think is personally fascinating, because at times it was almost like a regional piece of folklore. Even though it was true, the events discussed did occur, are real. Many people, even in our home state of Georgia, were absolutely unaware of the Anneewakee Treatment Center for Emotionally Disturbed Youth. Could you tell us a little bit about what this institution was and how you personally learned about it, even before you thought of pursuing this as a show?
Sure. Yeah, I had, like many people, never heard of it before at all till about 2 years ago. I guess it was July of 2019. And we talk about this in the episode, but the Cliffs Notes was basically I was driving road trip in Florida with my wife and her friend, and she knew I'd been working in the true crime field and said, Josh, you need to do a podcast on Anneewakee. And, what the heck is that? I've never heard that word before. And basically all she knew was that some abuse had gone on at this school for boys in Georgia. And the way that she had found out about it was through a family friend of hers who had adopted a donkey from the school, which is a notorious tale at this point now. But the donkey basically had been abused. They claimed the donkey had been abused has kind of offset aggression from what these kids had been through. So I came back and started looking into it, just curious. And it was odd how little internet presence there was. And the Wikipedia has changed quite a bit since then. But at the time, it was like 2 paragraphs for this school that was like a $50 million settlement and, you know, all of these charges brought, but nothing really online till you start combing through newspapers and that sort of thing. And then it was like the floodgates. Like, how have I not heard of this? And then you start asking around, and my parents were like, yeah, of course, that broke when you were just being born. So of course that hit home. And I think, like you said, it was almost like a folklore. And the more and more I looked into this, the more I found out I had these weird connections to this place. Not personally, but for instance, my wife's sister worked at a school that sounded similar. We eventually put it together. Oh my God, you were working at the place that used to be Anneewakee. And that was just chance after working on it for like 6 months or something.
Wow.
And then relatives of my wife's live out there, and they, oh yeah, well, we know stories about this guy and the sheriff and the, you know, all these connections that happened out there. So it really was a rabbit hole that just kept going the more you pulled that thread.
So let's define what this Anneewakee word, this place, what is it?
So the Anneewakee Treatment Center for Emotionally Disturbed Boys is the original title. And it's hard to say a little bit because it was a little amorphous. They would shift how it was presented through over the years, over like about little less than 3 decades, to what worked best for them. So at one point in time, it was called a hospital. At another point, it was a school. It started out as a foundation with community outreach and people donating money to it. But basically, it was a wilderness therapy program for emotionally disturbed kids. And it was just vague enough to where they could work government agencies, legal systems, insurance, to whatever would benefit them in the best way.
And what was the ballpark age range of the children involved here?
It could start pretty young. I've talked to people who were sent there when they were 9 to age 11, which is insane when you think about the work, some of the forced labor these kids were being forced to do. And it was a type of kind of hierarchy system where people would work through it and would then be promoted to a group leader and then a counselor. So the further it went, the further you could go in the program. And a lot of time, unfortunately, that was tied to different types of sexual abuse that were going on within it.
And for a lot of folks in the crowd today, when you hear the phrase wilderness therapy, you might associate it with like Boy Scouts or camping, you know what I mean? Or having troubled teens just sort of stroll around and lollygag in the woods. That's very much not the case. We know that wilderness therapy, in the most dry terms, it is behavior modification officially based on group activities. You know, like you said, Josh, people progress through these leadership roles, and you are supposed to become more acclimated to working with other people, and is supposed to help address maybe some of the emotional issues people have had. But although this treatment can be controversial at times, I believe there are examples of wilderness therapy in the modern day. Isn't that correct?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's something I had been aware of. I had known friends growing up who had done programs like Knowles is a very popular one. You know, and I think there's a span where it can be you're literally just dropped in the wilderness with a knife and some other few things and figured out to these more type camp settings where you have leaders teaching you how to make things and work in the wilderness in the elements. And I think that has proven to be very successful when done correctly with kids. You know, there's a lot of great programs out there. I'm going to be hopefully speaking with a really great one out of Florida that my friend had been involved with to kind of show the other side of this can actually work well.
Yeah, so I want to give just a quick modern example of wilderness therapy, and then I want to talk about why this would be needed or why wilderness therapy exists, right? What's being treated here? And you mentioned something called emotional behavior disorder, emotional and behavioral disorder, so we'll talk about that. But first of all, this wilderness therapy, it's called First Light Wilderness Therapy, and I'm going to read you a description from their website. It says that it's a full immersion therapy experience, and away from the distractions of everyday life, such as screen time and peers, students have the opportunity to benefit from round-the-clock therapeutic support. So there's a therapeutic support component to this, right? There are others that are going to be assisting in some kind of therapeutic fashion, but the wilderness, it says, the wilderness environment allows students to focus on regulation through attunement with the rhythms of nature, which is really interesting. It says students sleep in individual tents and follow a nomadic model of movement, setting up camp in a new area once or twice each week. So that's a slightly modified version of what Anneewakee was, but it just gives you an idea of what this is supposed to do. And it says it's for children between the ages of 12 and 18. So my question is to you, Josh, what is EBD, or emotional behavioral disorder, and what is it? Like, what does that even mean?
Emotional behavioral disorder is, and this was a very hard thing to define too, because these terms change from legal system to the medical system, the judicial system. But basically, how it was described to me was when you look at certain type of behaviors, like, say, a 2-year-old throwing a tantrum and things of that nature, for that age, that makes sense and that's to be expected. But when these type of behaviors continue on past this into other ages, then you start having an issue. And kids that have trouble expressing themselves can't deal with emotions correctly. That's kind of, I guess, the broadest type definition of that.
And it's highly likely that given the time span during which the treatment center operated, there were doubtlessly attendees that were misdiagnosed. This sort of label can be applied in a somewhat amorphous way, and this leads us to the next question, Josh. Anneewakee, I think, will surprise people. It's quite old, right? Could you tell us a little bit about how it came to be and where it's located?
Yeah, it actually went on for a surprising number of years. It was started sometime around 1962 in Douglasville, Georgia, and continued through probably close to 1988 before it was officially shut down and how it was known. And it expanded through those years. They went on to have 3 different campuses, one in Florida, another one for girls in Rockmart, Georgia. And by all means, I mean, it seems like they were ready to expand this even further. There was talk of them starting a branch in Mexico. They had bought land in Canada. I mean, this thing was only growing until somebody finally put a stop to it.
Something occurs to me. We recently did an episode about what I would see as similar organizations or institutions that parents essentially pay these, I guess, organizations to kidnap their kids, to come in the dead of night, take their kids and put them into these kind of reform school type scenarios. And all of these situations are rife for abuse. There's just so much lack of oversight. The parents are putting all of this trust in these groups, and there is not a lot of licensing oversight, not a lot of requirements even to start one of these, in a similar way to some rehab facilities or some like DUI schools, for example, that are subsidized by, the government, and people have to use them. I'm wondering if this forced labor situation with Anneewakee is in any way similar, or if there's a distinction between these two types of sort of forced reform schools for kids.
Yeah, and we try and follow this through the podcast, where it evolved or devolved, if you will, over the years, where, initially, as we were talking about emotionally disturbed behavior, this clear definition of this, but it would come to be just kids who had ADD, as simple as that, or, were depressed, things like that, where this is not necessarily the place to handle those types of things. So it did become just a place where a lot of times parents with money or good insurance could send their kids there. And they stood to make a lot of money doing that. And I think there's a span in these wilderness therapy camps where, yeah, like you said, it can be coming into your house in the middle of the night and grabbing your kids for you and sending them off, to somebody voluntarily going or being sent there by court order as a ward of the state. And as Anneewakee evolved over the years, it could shift to any one of those things within that spectrum, to whatever benefited them the best.
It's interesting because you've mentioned that this organization was somewhat of a chameleon, right? In terms of self-serving actions. At this point, there are two things that we have to address. These are covered in depth in Camp Hell. Josh, astute listeners of the show today will notice that you said there were kids who might have ADHD. There are kids who might have just been going through a very difficult emotional time, right? It's normal to be depressed at times. There were also children who had bounced out of other programs, if I'm correct here. And one of the things that I'd love for you to give our audience a sense of here is what actually happened to these kids. We've talked about the wilderness therapy, right? We've talked about the stated aims of this and similar other organizations. But what actually happened to these children? What made this different from something else in the troubled teen industry?
Yeah. And again, like everything, there's not one simple answer for that. There was a spectrum of experiences. And we tried to cover that in the podcast too. Some people left and say that was the best thing that ever happened to me. It made me who I am today. It taught me how to work. It taught me responsibility. But in all honesty, what was going on was forced labor by the kids. They were put through this backbreaking labor, many of them having lifelong medical issues from it, basically building the camp, building the campus they were paying to go to. All three of those campuses were built. There was a marina and hotel for profit built in Florida by the kids. Just things of this nature. They were getting free labor.
Didn't they build a lake?
Yeah, they dug out Anneewakee Lake, which is still in Douglasville on the map. If you look at a map, you would think Anneewakee is a town, and for all intents and purposes, it was. And Anneewakee Lake is still there, right? You take Anneewakee Road to get there.
And it is interesting, the varying perspectives that the folks that, went through this program at varying times, because they were all given numbers. So you can kind of track how long this program ran based on, the size of the number given to a particular, patient. I think it's interesting that it's called patient, since there's really no medical expertise involved here at all. The guy in charge of it goes by doctor, but he has no degree in medicine at all. It's just sort of like a self-proclaimed title, which is always very suspicious to me, very self-aggrandizing to refer to yourself in that way. And he did seem to have this kind of God complex. But one of the gentlemen you speak to in the first episode speaks very fondly of this guy and speaks very fondly of his experience. He taught him how to work with his hands, taught him how to use tools. And he had a hard time believing some of the allegations. I thought it was really smart and interesting that you led with that. And then obviously you see the diverging opinions and how, what is the real story.
Right. And that's continued to happen since it's come out. And I've had many survivors reach out from the gamut of thank you so much. I've went into therapy for the first time, or explain to my parents what I went through for the first time in 30 years, to people that had a great experience and are like, why aren't you talking about all the great things? So that's why I thought, let's start out. This wasn't all bad for everybody. And part of that has to do with the selection of kids that did go through some of this abuse. And also, that was a patient or survivor, they choose to go by, who attended in some of the earliest years. He was there in like 1962 or 63. So this program devolved in that it got a lot worse over the years.
So who was this doctor that Nola's mentioned there?
Yeah, Louis Jerome Doc Petter. He went way further back in Georgia history than I realized. I found out that he had been in the papers since the 1940s, but he started Anneewakee with him and his wife Mabel and another guy named Brett Baxley, who's kind of a mysterious figure. But Doc Petter has had a history of working in government agencies, working in the Fulton County court system as a probation officer and court psychologist, working in Savannah with DFACS, Department of Family and Children's Services, and just a charismatic character that was great at community outreach and getting funds for people to help troubled kids. And so I found out through going through his background, you see this progression from Boy Scout leader to, church pastor to there's this article in the Atlanta paper I couldn't believe from the 50s where it's, the Key Club of Atlanta raises money to help troubled youth. And even back then, he's having this community raise funds for this troubled kid. And it was like a lot of money, like every member giving $100 a month. When you think that, add that up in the 1950s, like 150 people or something like that. And then like 3 years later, it's like, kid turned his life around, success, thanks to Louis Petter and this organization. So it just continued from there, and he was able to keep doing community outreach and getting funds to where he bought this land to create Anneewakee.
Do you believe that it would be fair to say Dr. Petter is a predator or was a predator at the time?
Without a doubt. Absolutely. I've heard many personal testimonies from people. This guy created this whole atmosphere. It wasn't just him abusing and preying on these kids. He taught it to other people. He encouraged it to go on at the camp to the point of having his own group of inner circle, they called it, of boys who rotated over decades. And they would live in his house with him and his family. This is going on right under their nose. So yeah, he was about as evil as you could get, in my mind.
How did the story start to get out? Was it just a couple of patients that started telling, an authority figure, telling a parent or something? Like how did people find out about it?
The most surprising thing when I first looked into this that jumped out to me was in 1970, there was a hearing for abuse going on at the camp. It wasn't a criminal investigation at all. It was a hearing regarding their license as I'm trying to remember how they were described at the time because it changed so many times over the years, as a child-caring institution. It simply had to do with their license, and as the head of it, if Louis Petter was fit to head a child-caring institution. So back at this point, you have people giving firsthand testimony of sexual abuse by this guy, recorded in court transcript, in the public accounts, and nothing happened. In short, the place continued on. They were granted their license. There was a disclaimer that Louis Petter could not interact with the boys. What that basically diluted down to from then on was he couldn't go into their sleeping quarters, but still had his office on campus, was still there, was still interacting with them, taking them on trips, still having them stay in his house. And the same organization that oversaw that hearing turned out to have a lot of connections with Louis Petter. I can't say the organization. I'd say the person who was in charge of the organization turned out to have a very close tie to Louis Petter, which led to nothing happening it went on for another 25 years.
And I believe that initial investigation in the 70s, Josh, it wasn't made public, was it?
No, not at all. It was very kept under wraps. We actually have a story with one of the whistleblowers, Robert D'Agostino, who was great. He was threatened. He was about to take he had just taken the bar at that point, a young attorney, and somebody tipped him off and said, hey, they're about to seal this document. You need to get down here and get a copy of this court transcript, and that will give you leverage because they're going to go after you and make sure you don't pass the bar. You can't practice as an attorney. And that's what he did. And he held on to those transcripts all those years and provided them to me, thankfully.
Wait, who was going to go after him?
Anneewakee in some way. I mean, they were going to try and stop him from being able to be a practicing attorney. So that was his kind of saving grace to hold on to that court transcript, which he did.
And we'll pause for a word from our sponsor before returning with Josh Thane and Campbell Anneewakee. And we're back. And now we're starting to unravel some of the timeline here. For context, folks, this is a profoundly disturbing example of something that happens more often than you might think. You know, you'll hear news about a scandal that rocks a Boy Scout troop or something like that. And we've got a lot of former Scouts in the audience today. I myself am an Eagle Scout. There's Matt right there. It's cool to be in wilderness, to build bridges. I am going to say that making a fire from the ordinary means with the stick and the rubby thing, that stinks. Just bring a lighter. That's not worth it. But
also digging an entire lake is probably not that fun.
That's true. And also, fun fact, a lot of people don't know this, Georgia has no natural lakes. Every lake in Georgia has been man-made. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that we see in tragic tales such as this, we see some common tropes, and they should trouble you folks. One of the common tropes that Josh, you just hit upon is that people knew. Someone knew. And whether it's through incompetence or self-interest or just plain old bribery, they let this stuff continue, or they perhaps deluded themselves into saying, well, who can trust these kids, right? Who knows? They may be making something up, et cetera, et cetera. But as you and Matt pointed out, again, that's what kills me about this. This was in the news. And I don't know how, I think it wasn't quite public knowledge yet, right? That's maybe we have to fast forward a decade to the 80s?
Yeah.
Okay, how did this break out? What happened?
Well, so this goes on, the hearing happens, and for another 25 years, the program gets worse. More kids are subjected to this abuse. It just spreads. And sometime around the mid-'80s, the organization starts to crumble a little bit. People are finding out these awful events are happening around it. One kid committed suicide and jumped off a roof there. Another one escaped and stole a gun from, I forget how he got the gun, but he ended up murdering somebody who was staying there. So these things start happening and start growing more attention to it. The behavior is getting more outlandish. They're caring less and less of the fact that they might get caught. And eventually it breaks in the mid-'80s. And then once that happened, somebody broke the story. Actually, I think it was Albert Edgen, the journalist we speak to in the podcast, who was extremely helpful, that this hearing had happened in the 1970s, and it went unnoticed. So really, that did not even come to light till the whole thing had been broken open by the mid-'80s.
Wow. I want to jump off something you said, Ben, which I think this is really important for this story and probably for definitely for right now in the modern era. The stigma that comes with being diagnosed with something, at least in Georgia, that would be described as emotional and behavior disorder, or even ADD, or a troubled kid, or an adolescent that is for some reason or another not performing the way that society would wish they would, or a parent or a teacher or anyone really. There's a stigma that comes with that no matter how trustworthy or not that child is, the statement maybe of that child is going to be, if it's weighed against a doctor or the leader of a program or, an adult, it's not going to hold as much weight, which is a real issue. I think it must have been tough going up against essentially institutions and government structures like that to advocate for these kids who were in real trouble when they were at Anneewakee. You said that there was D'Agostino as a whistleblower. There's some journalists you talked to. Can you tell us more about that journalist and maybe the journey that journalist took to uncover some of this? Right.
Yeah, I didn't realize how big a part of his journey it was until I spoke with him. Albert Edgen was a reporter in Tallahassee for the Tallahassee Democrat in the early 80s. And they had been tipped off to this story that there were some accusations at Anneewakee's second campus in Carabel, Florida, near Tallahassee. And he covered the story for like 6 years, ultimately leading to 60 Minutes doing a story on it. And they recruited him to help coach the anchor who interviewed Jim Parham, one of the Petter's confidants who had covered for them for many years. And that led to him working with 60 Minutes for another many years. So Anneewakee really kind of brought him into the mainstream in his journalism career. And we flew up to Virginia to Albert's home right at the start of quarantine, actually. It was the weekend before lockdown started. So I remember at the time it was like, are we going to do this? Are we going to get on this flight and go bring this suitcase of documents back with us or not? And we did, thankfully. And I'm sitting here in my room covered in file folders and documents. I mean, he had kept everything from his research. And I think at the time he probably wasn't even able to cover as much of that, which is why it's been done so well to cover it in the podcast form, because there is just so many tentacles to this thing.
And we do want to point out that we've talked extensively off air in the past about how best to address subjects that, many people would rather not hear about, especially if they've survived trauma of their own. But we feel that this information is both important and empowering. And I think one of the most profound things to me about your work on Camp Hell is first, I would say the empathy with which people involved are treated. And secondly, the way this story, very unfortunately, moves through time. When you had that moment, Josh, when you kind of could see the forest of the problems of Anneewakee and could see the timeline, where did you, as Noel said, you start with something that is not immediately, super heavy, right? And you want to illustrate that not everybody had the same experience, but where do you see the story going? As now that you know what you know, and now that you have this research, you have this documentation.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I was asked by people who may have been involved who didn't want to speak with me is, why are you telling this story now? Why are you digging this up? And the answer is so that it doesn't happen again, because this type of thing still happens. These organizations are still out there. In fact, there's a whole industry, I would say, of emotional growth schools, as they're called, and wilderness therapy schools. And not all of them are doing good. And these types of things still happen. And there's not really any huge oversight. I've heard recently of a bill trying to be passed. I think Paris Hilton may have been involved with it because she was sent to a school similar to this. She has a documentary out recently about it.
Well, that was an unexpected cameo.
It is, right, yeah. I was surprised, too, that happened just by chance around the same time of this. But basically a bill to give national oversight to organizations like this. And there's not one. And in my research going through this, you see how easy it was for this type of behavior to keep going on. They were just so tied into the system. It was too big. It was described by a few people as the state of Georgia needed this program more than to break it up because of a few bad apples. And hopefully parents think twice about this or look into it. If you're being told that you can't have contact with your child, that we're going to screen any contact, that's like red flag immediately right there. Things of that nature. So why do we cover these stories like this? So it doesn't happen again, basically.
We do this all the time on the show, a little bit of a caveat. I want to make sure that everyone listening knows there are thousands of individuals and probably dozens, if not hundreds of organizations out there right now doing their level best to help kids who are, in some way having trouble, right? And wilderness therapy, as my wife can attest, wilderness therapy can be hugely beneficial for a child who's just having trouble dealing with the way society wants them to behave. It doesn't mean this is happening everywhere. It does mean that the bad things are happening and peppered throughout the systems. And I think that is why your work is so important here, Josh.
Thanks. No, I think you're right, Matt. And as I said, I hope to, by the time this project is done, to show some examples of how some good programs like that, like they aren't all like this. This can work. This idea is actually a good one. It was just abused in the worst possible way.
Yeah, by opportunists and predators. Yeah, you're raising an incredibly poignant and powerful point, and it's one we need to emphasize. We talked about this in our exploration of big rehab and the so-called sober living homes. Again, like Matt said, like you said, Josh, there are many people who are doing their level best, not for money, not for power or fame. They genuinely want to help people. This is not a story about those actors. This is the point you hit, the one we always need to emphasize. There is no federal oversight. The laws are state by state, meaning that in the right state, we could all get together, buy some land somewhere, call ourselves doctors. I love it when people do that, like whenever it happens in other institutions as well. There are a lot of people who just decide to call themselves bishops. That's all I'm saying.
I know I've got something in my car that says I'm ordained in some way because I paid some money.
Oh yeah. Are you ministers? That's right. We don't talk about on air too much, but Matt and I are both technically ministers.
Universal Life Church, maybe? Is that what it's called? I don't remember.
How could you forget? Look,
I've got my cards.
One of my favorites was Robert Anton Wilson. You are now a pope.
Yes, yeah. And also, we can, just to be clear, folks, we can marry you, but we cannot divorce you. Turns out you do have to have some more qualifications to divorce people. But if you want to,
it's the paperwork.
It's the paperwork, really. But why is this important? Why is it crucial that there be some sort of oversight? Josh, from the story of Camp Help, which is ongoing, and Matt and Noel and I have listened to it, it becomes quickly obvious that there were secrets, right? There were conspiracies and cover-ups, and there was doubtlessly corruption afoot. When you say that we're exploring this show together to prevent something like this from happening in the future, has anyone reached out to you with similar experiences, or what are some of the reactions you've received? Because you said someone was just texting you earlier.
Yeah. Well, first off, the survivors, the people that attended, have been hugely important to being able to make this, being able to get an idea of actually what went on. Because obviously with something like this, the people that worked there or were involved do not want to talk about it. A lot of the survivors, luckily, over time, were willing to come and speak with me and tell me about their experience. And since then, I've had survivors I didn't talk to reach out saying, thank you for covering this. This has been hugely cathartic for me and led to getting some therapy. Or somebody else said they finally were able to talk to their parents about it who had never told them this. A lot of them felt guilt, didn't want their parents to feel guilt, so they never opened up about the abuse they experienced there. And on top of the survivors, I've had a few people reach out with similar stories saying, please look into this. One that just seemed like this huge summer camp that like 20,000 kids get sent to every year, that had largely been NDAs and things like that, where people by contract cannot speak about. There was another organization in Florida that went on for like over 100 years, to the point where they had found unmarked graves there. And just in the past few years, Florida had paid out so many millions of dollars to families where they found their relatives had died at this place and never been reported. That's obviously like the most extreme example I've ever heard of. But there are places that are still out there today where this is happening. I can't say to the extent that Anneewakee was, but there are still not good places.
And with that, we're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more discussion with Josh Thane. And we return to our discussion with Josh. So you just mentioned Florida again, and you early in this discussion, you mentioned that there were campuses in Florida, a couple places in Georgia, and then possibly in Mexico and Canada. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the money behind the organizations? Yeah. And it strikes me that if you've got essentially free labor, or labor that's paying you to do for the for the opportunity to do the hard labor for your organization, it feels like you could make a lot of money. And I'm just wondering, like, what was the money situation like with Anneewakee, and what was the property situation like?
The property was massive. I was in the town of Douglasville. I'd have to check the exact square footage, but they kept buying land around there. And I mean, that town of Douglasville was Anneewakee for some years. As I said before, Louis Petter was great at community outreach. So he had this board of the directors of important people in the community who were also some very wealthy, who were giving a lot of money to this organization. Once they finally were able to get a medical license, at that point, you're talking insurance premiums. So then you can make the price whatever you want. And if the kids have good insurance, or their families do, then they're going to pay it. So this just expanded over years to where, as I said, they built a second campus in Florida, in this little town of Carabel, right on the Gulf. This big marina town, and, really good real estate to own, not far from Panama City Beach. And then they built a women's campus in Rockmart. And they had, by the time everything shook out legally in the 80s, it was found that they had property in Mexico. They had property in Canada. And in a really smart way, this guy, Louis Petter, built up a second corporation called Anneewakee Estates. And he put his three daughters, Marcia, Rita, and Dana, as the head of it. The land owned by Anneewakee Estates was then being rented to the Anneewakee Foundation. So basically, they're taking the money from insurance and then putting it back in their own pocket through this other corporation. So Anneewakee's paying rent for the property that it sits on to Anneewakee Estates, who are the Petter family. So basically, they were able to make millions. And then you hear all these other stories about bringing jewels and gifts from very wealthy families in Mexico, sneaking them back over the border. And even I had heard a story. Louis Petter had a fake leg that he had a wooden leg, and that he would even hide jewels from these wealthy families in Mexico in his leg to bring over the border. And at some point, he actually had to give up like $30,000 worth of jewelry to the county of Douglasville. So yeah, there's a lot of money tied into this place.
I can't tell if that's fraud. I don't know legally if that is fraud, to like own the company that then your nonprofit or your medical, whatever it is, pays rent to. There
was definitely some shady financial stuff going on, and that was kind of the start of the end. First off, they were calling themselves a nonprofit organization on top of all this, which they were absolutely profiting. And they were also tax exempt. So when you start messing with taxes, the insurance companies start questioning what's really going on here, what type of treatment is happening, are we really, should we really be paying you this? That's when things kind of got a little weird. And there were a few kind of mysterious deaths that happened around that time. One of them was the accountant for the place. And so when things get weird with the money, people start infighting. That was kind of what led to finally some cracks in the foundation for law enforcement to get involved.
I've heard a rumor that I think we talked about a long time ago in discussion of this. There's a rumor about where all that money that was made kind of went. We can't say the name of the organization, but
there's a very large, powerful educational organization in Georgia that is a very close relation to the Petter family, was a part of the Petter family, and began around the time that Anneewakee was broken up. So where all that money from Anneewakee ended up at, we know some of it went to Douglasville, but questionable.
Some was paid to victims and families, right?
Yes.
Through the settlement?
I would say more was paid to attorneys, but some were paid out in a settlement, in a class action lawsuit. But yeah, this large educational organization started around the same time, so it's questionable where some of that seed money may have come from.
And
it's a rumor.
Yeah, we
Just
are
a rumor.
Being careful on purpose, folks. But this is the stuff I love, Josh. This is we're getting to the part of the story where we all realize that this is ongoing. History is very much with us. Faulkner is correct. This is not a dusty story from an outdated history book. The people who survived this are alive. And, as we said, Camp Hell is ongoing right now. There are some spoilers that Matt, Noel, and I don't know. We're right there with you, folks. We can ask Josh stuff and he'll tell us, sorry, you got to wait for episode, 8 or something like that. So we're on this journey with you. Josh, I have to ask because it's killing me. I think it's something that is on the mind of a lot of our folks in the audience today. Is Dr. Petter alive?
No. He lived to be the ripe old age of 92.
Wow.
And yeah, I mean, spoiler alert or not, you can find out. But case in point, he lived much longer than, let's say, the authorities thought he would. And largely lived out the rest of his life okay with him and his wife and a couple German Shepherds.
So he was found guilty of some of these things?
There was a settlement reached. A deal was made.
Oh my gosh, the mystery. To give you a sense of the stakes here, we do have to be careful with language when we say things like there was a settlement reached.
There was, absolutely. I mean, that's known public document. And I spoke with the DA and extensively about this, which we'll get into in some of these later episodes. And by all purposes, it sounded in speaking with him that this was extremely difficult to take this place down. It was so entrenched in local government and education and all of these things that they had to do whatever they could to just break up this organization, break up the money, make sure that it couldn't keep going on. And, unfortunately, when that happens, sometimes a lot of people get off still. Some people never get charged. This second campus in Florida, nothing happened. Nobody was charged down there at all. And that's what's really heartbreaking when you get to the truth of this stuff, that there was no unsoiled justice for these people. Every step of the way, there was always an asterisk when something seemed to be getting done about it.
And this makes it a genuine conspiracy at times, right? When we know that when you get down into the local level of a lot of communities, the governments, the authorities are, human, easily corruptible. There's still people that live in a relatively small sphere, right, of familiar contacts. We all go to the Key Club or the Lions Club or whatever, so I can help you take the heat off, etc. Do you think that the average resident of Douglasville is aware of Anneewakee at this point, or is it just like a weird series of names on streets?
Yeah, it's funny how you talked about the folklore of it. Since then, in speaking with people or people reaching out to me through the Instagram page or writing reviews of the podcast, people would say things like, gosh, I didn't think this was real. We heard stories, or, I used to live by there. I had no clue this thing went on, from people having completely no idea to, gosh, we always heard stories, or like one of my wife's relatives said something like, oh yeah, I remember people when we were kids, they'd be like, I'm going to send you to Anneewakee if you act up. Things like that. You know what I mean? Where it's just kind of known, but not really the extent. And even today, though, a lot of younger people have no clue what went on. When I went to Florida, and Carabel is a town with literally no stoplight, to give you an idea of the size of it. Very small. And even then, with this happening, 35, 40 years ago now, most of the town had no clue about it unless they were there at the time. And if they weren't, it's like it was just completely erased off the history books. And as you said, with authorities being involved, that was another factor that led to it finally being broken up, was a change of sheriff in Douglasville. For years, there was this guy, Sheriff Abercrombie, who he had a horse farm, and they'd go do horse lessons over at the sheriff's house or go work on his house. And finally that shifted to this really controversial figure, Sheriff Earl Lee, who was kind of a badass up in those parts, apparently. And he was the one that finally, had been hearing things and decided to try and do something about it. So yeah, definitely lots of people that were aware of this. And we found out later too that Louis Petter had been ousted from DFAX in Savannah for doing questionable things with kids, and somehow kept weaving his way through government bodies after that.
That was a really disturbing early part of the podcast, hearing about the details of that, and I kind of don't even want to go into them right now about what he was doing with those kids, but it's worth listening to an episode to hear it if you're interested, but it is Well,
it's just mind-blowing to me that people working in these organizations were like, that there are these, like, I don't want to say wives' tales because they were true, but that, like, these rumors of this awful behavior going on about a guy, and, like, nobody called the cops. It was just like, oh yeah, he left because he was doing this thing.
Yeah, and again, it's unfortunately a pattern that we see all too often. People navigating through these Byzantine layers of power and bureaucracy to isolate their victims, right? This is purposeful. Dr.
Absolutely.
Petter was not improvising. Yeah.
No, he was a master of what you just described, for sure.
Like you said, everyone describes him as one of the most charismatic people that they've encountered. So, like, on the surface, he was operating at that level.
And at this point, folks, to be absolutely transparent with you, this story is not a story that Matt, Noel, and I tell. And this is a story that, Josh, you have uncovered. And I would say you're telling the story collectively, right? With the survivors, with the DAs, with the people who were working to bring it to light. The story is ongoing. Camp Hell Anneewakee is available now wherever you find your podcast. And it is also, as we said at the top, in our opinion, an incredibly crucial story right now because these things are ongoing. Josh, I'd like to first thank you for being so generous with your time today, man. But secondly, where can people learn more? Where would you direct them?
Yes, we actually did a really great interview with the head of the National Center for Child Advocacy, and we have released that as a full bonus episode if you want to check it out. His name's Chris Newland, and he really breaks a lot of this stuff down, things to look for, how they work with all the different types of organizations, multidisciplinary, such as law enforcement, the judicial system, educators, social workers, which you really have to do in these types of things because that's how things get covered up. And that's how they go on for years, is not checking across the board. Another website that he recommended to me to check out is the Darkness to Light website. And that has a lot of resources if you're concerned about something, if you want to know what to look for, or just need to know where to go to report something. So Darkness to Light, that website.
And that's D2L.org.
Correct. Yeah. Thank you guys so much for having me on. I really appreciate y'all letting me speak about it.
Yeah. Thanks for covering the story, man. I'm glad it's finally like happening. It's crazy to think that it's happening after, just from a quick little, hey, little conversation in a car to, hey, I'm thinking about this story to now I think you're like 8 or 9 episodes in when this episode comes out. So
yeah, about 2 years in the works. And again, thank you, Matt, for pushing me to keep pulling that thread, which we still are.
Yeah, I also, just on a personal level, peek behind the curtain, pre-pandemic, Josh and I were work neighbors. And I still remember your very weird first day, my friend. But,
yes.
but
did you hear a lot of like, what? Coming from his desk?
Yeah, it's a lot of surprise my first day. That's another story.
That's another story, but I do want to just check in and say, hope you are doing well, because these things can wear on you, so as he said earlier, for anyone who feels like they are struggling either with something that happened in the past, something that is ongoing, do know you are not alone. There are resources available. And stories like this are important for exactly the reason Josh said earlier. When we are empowered with knowledge, we have the ability, we cannot change the past, of course, but we do have the ability to work toward a better future, hopefully. And that is a much needed, I think, positive note in the world we live in today. We want to hear your experiences. Check out Camp Hell, Anneewakee. You will be able to find resources online. There is a Facebook page as well, is there not, Josh?
Yes, it's actually a podcast discussion group my wife created, and it has been amazing to see the feedback on that. So many survivors have now become a part of it. They have their own Anneewakee Survivor Facebook page, but they've also come and to give insight into things we talk about on the podcast or people that have spoken on it. And very interesting to just see the back and forth of what people remember, or posting old pictures of the campus and their experiences. And there's really a whole community of the people. I mean, thousands of kids went through this place, and a lot of the survivors still keep in touch. And mostly all of them have been very supportive of it. So check out the Camp Hell Anneewakee podcast discussion Facebook group. And we also have an Instagram page, Camp Hell Pod, on Instagram, with just more pictures of things that I've seen and people involved and that type of thing.
And you can also, while you're online, drop by and visit Matt, Noel, and myself. We're Conspiracy Stuff Show, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the hits. Check out our YouTube channel, which is also Conspiracy Stuff. And if you are not the type of person to sip on the social meds, but you have a story to tell, then never fear. We have many other ways you can contact us. One of our favorite is our phone number, isn't it, Matt?
That's right. We have a phone number. It is 1-833-STDWYTK. And when you call, please tell us the name you would like for us to refer to you as. It doesn't have to be a real name. It could be a really cool nickname,
like
or a
Snakebite.
Oh, code names. Yes. And then just leave us your message. Then anything you want to say personally to us, please leave it at the end. It's just easier for us to keep the important part right in the front. We can put it on the air. Oh, also, let us know if we can use your message on air. That's important. Just for legal reasons. Our lawyers appreciate it, and so do we. And we ask that you only call once if you can. If you've got a lot to say, we recommend you use our good old-fashioned email address, where we are
conspiracy@iHeartRadio.com.
Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.